who is a writer, a journalist, and a translator. His essays and articles have appeared in the Monarch Review, Los Angeles Magazine, Outside Online, and other magazines. His first published short story, Seeds, appeared in the summer 2017 issue of Ninth Letter and has been nominated for the Penn Robert J. Dow Short Story Prize for Emerging Writers. Daniel Davis.
It didn't win. So I'd actually like to cede my time to Adam, so we can just listen to 15 more minutes of German erotica. Is that okay? No, it's not. Alright, I guess I'll read something then. So I'm going to read Julio Cortázar was an Argentine writer from the 20th century. He's often considered one of the first writers of the Latin American boom. And he lived many years in France, where the story is going to take place. So I reserve the right to mispronounce every French word. So I'm going to read just the first two sentences of the Spanish. That's about a page and a half in Cortázar's prose. And it requires a lot of lungs. So if you see me turning blue, that's why. In Spanish, it's La Autopista del Sur. I'm calling it the Southern Highway. Al principio, la muchacha del Delfín había insistido en llevar la cuenta del tiempo, aunque al ingeniero del Peugeot 404 le daba ya lo mismo. Cualquiera podía mirar ese reloj, pero era como si ese tiempo atado a la muñeca derecha o el pip-pip de la radio midieran otra cosa. Fuera el tiempo de los que no han hecho la estupidez de querer regresar a París por la autopista del sur un domingo de tarde, y apenas salidos de Fontainebleau han tenido que ponerse al paso, detenerse. 6 filas a cada lado, ya se sabe que los domingos la autopista está íntegramente reservada a los que regresan a la capital. Poner en marcha el motor, avanzar 3 metros, detenerse, charlar con las 2 monjas del 2HP a la derecha, con la muchacha del Delfín a la izquierda, mirar por el retrovisor al hombre pálido que conduce un carabé, envidiar irónicamente la felicidad avícola del matrimonio del Peugeot 203, detrás del Delfín de la muchacha, que juega con su niñita y hace bromas y come queso, o sufrir de a ratos los desbordes exasperados de los 2 jovencitos del Simca que precede al Peugeot 404, y hasta bajarse en los altos y explorar sin alejarse mucho, porque nunca se sabe en qué momento los autos de más adelante reanudarán la marcha y habrá que recorrer para que los de atrás no inicien la guerra de las bocinas y los insultos. Y así llegar a la altura de un Taunus delante del Delfín de la muchacha que mira a cada momento la hora, y cambiar unas frases descorazonadas o burlonas con los hombres que viajan con un niño rubio cuya inmensa diversión en esas precisas circunstancias consiste en hacer correr libremente su autito de juguete sobre los asientos y al reborde posterior del Taunus, o atreverse y avanzar todavía un poco más, puesto que no parece que los autos de adelante vayan a reanudar la marcha, y contemplar con alguna lástima el matrimonio de ancianos en el ID Citreón, que parece una gigantesca bañadera violeta donde sobrenadan los 2 viejitos, él descansando los antebrazos en el volante con un aire de paciente fatiga, ella mordisqueando una manzana con más aplicación que ganas. Okay, on to the English. So, this is a long story. I'm not going to read all of it. I'm going to read probably less than half of it. We'll see. It's about a 10,000 word story, so we'll see what I can get through. You can just throw something at my head. It's getting too long.
I've got a good one.
But if anyone would like the whole story, please let me know. I'd be happy to email it to you. It's a really good story. Okay, the Southern Highway. At first, the girl in the Delfín had insisted on keeping track of the time, though it was all the same to the engineer in the Peugeot 404. Anyone could check their clock, but it was as if that time strapped to the right wrist or the beep-beep of the radio measured something else, a time belonging to those who hadn't so stupidly wanted to return to Paris by the Southern Highway on a Sunday afternoon, and having just left Fontainebleau, have had to slow to a crawl, stop, 6 lanes on each side. Everyone already knows on Sundays the highway is entirely reserved for anyone returning to the capital. put the motor in drive, advance 3 meters, stop, chat with the 2 nuns and the 2 HP on the right, with the girl in the Dauphine on the left, check the rearview mirror and see the ghastly man driving his Caravelle, ironically envy the married couple, happy as plucked chickens, in the Peugeot 203 behind the girl's Dauphine, as they play with their little girl and joke around and eat cheese, or sometimes suffer the exasperating antics of the teens in the Simca, bringing up the rear of the Peugeot 404, and even get out of the cars and explore, never straying too far, because one never knows when the cars ahead will get going and make everyone scamper back to their cars to avoid starting a war of honk and insults. And, as such, to get as far as the Taunus in front of the Dauphine, where the girl still has her eyes glued to the clock, and to exchange a few sly or despairing words with the men traveling with a blonde kid whose endless amusement in such circumstances consists of freely wheeling his toy car on the seats and back edge of the Taunus, or dare to advance a little further, since it seems the cars ahead won't budge, and contemplate with a certain pang the old married couple in the ID Citroën that sits like a giant violet bathtub, with 2 old folks bobbing atop its waters, he resting his forearms on the steering wheel with an air of patient fatigue, she nibbling an apple with more determination than desire. The 4th time he found himself surrounded by all that, doing all that, the engineer had decided to stop getting out of his car, hoping the police would somehow break up the traffic jam. The August heat compounded with the hot pavement to make the stillness more and more exhausting. It was all the stench of gasoline, the grating shouts of the teenagers in the Simca, the ricochet of sunshine on glass and chrome trim, and, to top it off, the contradictory sensation of burial beneath an overgrown jungle of machines meant to move. The engineer's 404 occupied the 2nd lane, counting to the right from the center divider, with 8 cars to his right and 7 to his left, though he could only clearly see the 8 cars that surrounded him and their occupants, who he was already tired of staring at. He had chatted with everyone, save for the boys in the Simca who seemed rude. From lane to lane they had discussed the situation in its finest detail, and the general impression was that, up to Corbeil-Essonnes, they would advance at a crawl or slower, but between Corbeil and Houvissy, I warned you about the French pronunciations, the rhythm would pick up once the helicopters and motorcyclists managed to break up the worst of the bottleneck. No one doubted some serious accident must have happened somewhere in the area, the only explanation for such an incredible slowdown. Plus, the government, the heat, taxes, one topic after another, 3 meters, another cliché, 5 meters, a grim verdict or muttered curse. The 2 nuns and the 2 HP would have liked to arrive in Milly-la-Forêt before 8, since they had a basket of veggies to cook. The married couple in the Peugeot 203 wanted more than anything not to miss the games on at 9:30. The girl in the Dauphine had told the engineer she didn't care if she was late to Paris, but that she was complaining on principle, because she considered it an outrage to treat thousands of people like camels in a caravan. In those last hours, it must have been 5 o'clock, but the heat was ruthless. The engineer thought they'd advanced some 50 meters, even if one of the men in the Taunus had stopped by to chat, leading the little boy with the toy car by the hand, and sarcastically pointed out a solitary banana tree, and the girl in the Dauphine remarked how the banana tree, if it wasn't a chestnut tree, had been lined up with her car for so long that it was no longer worth it to check her watch and keep tinkering with useless calculations. The day was endless. The sun's vibration on blacktop and car panels spread a sickening vertigo. Everyone started to improvise protection, black sunglasses, handkerchiefs damp with cologne to cool the head, all to guard against shrill reflections or the tailpipes that hacked up smoke with each advance. These means were organized and perfected. They were all anyone could talk about. The engineer got out again to stretch his legs, had a few words with the couple, probably country folk, in the Ariane, ahead of the nuns in the 2 HP. Behind the 2 HP, a soldier and girl who looked to be married rode in a Volkswagen. The engineer lost interest in anything outside his own surrounding ranks, since he'd have to risk straying too far from his 404 to investigate. He saw colors, forms, Mercedes-Benz, ID, 4R, Lancia, Skoda, Maurice Minor, the complete catalog. To the left, opposite the center divider, spread another weedy mass of Renault, Anglia, Peugeot, Porsche, Volvo. He found it so monotonous that finally, after chatting with the man in the Taunus and unsuccessfully trying to chat with the lone wolf in the Caravelle, there was nothing left to do but return to his 404 and restart the same conversation on the time, weather, distances, and cinema with the girl in the Dauphine. Sometimes a foreigner would arrive, slipping between cars and coming from the other side of the highway or the outer lanes on the right, bringing some news, probably false, repeated from car to car along the hot kilometers. The foreigner would savor the success of his novelties, the slamming car doors, as passengers rushed to comment on whatever happened. But after a bit, some honk or starting engine would interrupt, and the foreigner would bolt, zigzagging between cars, finding his own in which to take cover from the understandable wrath of the others. In such a way, throughout the afternoon, the so-called facts spread. The crash of a Floride against a 2HP near Courbevoie, 3 dead and a little boy injured. The double crash of a Fiat 1500 against a Renault wagon that had crushed an Austin full of English tourists. A flipped Orly shuttle crammed with passengers straight off a flight from Copenhagen. The engineer was sure it was all, or mostly all, false, though something serious must have happened near Courbevoie and maybe as far as Paris to cripple the traffic flow so severely. The farmers in the Ariane, who had a plot near Montereau and knew the region well, told of another Sunday where the traffic jammed for 5 hours. That incident seemed trivial now that the sun, settling down to the left of the route, was dumping one last avalanche of orange jelly on each car, boiling metal, clouding the view, without a treetop ever fading behind, or a hint of shadow glimpsed in the distance approaching in order to truly feel that the column was moving, even if it was barely so, even though they would have to stop and start the engine and slam the brakes and never shift past the first gear, the stinging letdown of once again shifting from first to a dead stop, foot brake, hand brake, stop, again and again and again. At some point, tired of inaction, the engineer had decided to take advantage of an especially endless stop to cross the lanes on the left. And leaving the Dauphine behind, he found a DKW, another 2HP, a Fiat 600, and stopped next to a De Soto to chit-chat with an overwhelmed tourist from Washington who understood almost no French, but had to be at the Place de la Brea at 8, without fail, you understand, my wife will be awfully damn anxious, damn it. And they talked about a bit of everything, when a man with an air of a traveling salesman exited his DKW to say someone had arrived a little earlier with news that a Piper Club had crashed in the middle of the highway, several dead. The American could care less about the Piper Club, and same with the engineer, who heard a chorus of horns and hurried to return to his 404, passing the news along to the men in the Taunus and the married couple in the 203. He saved a more detailed account for the girl in the Dauphine, while the car slowly advanced a few meters. The Dauphine now trailed slightly behind the 404, and later it would be the reverse, but, in fact, the 12 lanes practically moved as a single block, as if some invisible cop in the background of the highway were ordering a simultaneous advance where no one could one-up the other. Piper Club, miss, is a small private plane. And the bad idea to crash in the middle of the highway on a Sunday afternoon, stuff like that. If only there was less heat in the damned cars, if they could finally leave those trees behind, if the last digit on the odometer would finish its fall into its tiny black hole instead of hanging by the tail endlessly. At some point, night had gently begun to fall, the horizon of car roofs taking on a tinge of lilac. A large white butterfly settled on the Dauphine's windshield, and the girl engineer admired its wings and the brief and perfect suspension of its repose. With a certain pang and nostalgia, they watched it drift away, fly over the Taunus and the violet ID with the old folks, go toward the Fiat 600 now invisible to the 404, return toward the Simca where a hunting hand uselessly tried to trap it, sweetly flutter over the Ariane with the farmers who seemed to be eating something, and then lose itself somewhere to the right. At dusk, the column had its first significant advance of almost 40 meters. When the engineer casually checked the odometer, half of the 6 had disappeared and a hint of 7 dangled from above. Almost everyone listened to their radios. The teenagers in the Simca had cranked the volume to full blast and together sang a twist that rocked and buzzed the carriage of their car. The nuns counted their rosaries. The little boy from the Taunus had fallen asleep with his face stuck to the glass without dropping his toy car. Sometime later, it was now fully night, foreigners arrived with more news, as contradictory as the now forgotten news from before. No, there hadn't been a Piper Club, but a hang glider piloted by the daughter of a general. It was true, a Renault wagon had crushed in Austin, though not in Juvisy, but also at the gates of Paris. The foreigners explained to the couple in the 203 that the highway pavement had given way near Igny, and 5 cars tipped after sagging their wheels in the cracks. The idea of a natural disaster made its way to the engineer, who shrugged without comment. Later, thinking of those first dark hours, when they'd been able to breathe a little more freely, he remembered reaching out his window to drum on the Dauphine and wake the girl who had fallen asleep leaning against the steering wheel, not worried about another advance. It might have been midnight when one of the nuns timidly offered him a ham sandwich, supposing he was hungry. The engineer accepted it out of courtesy. In reality, he felt nauseated, and asked to split it with the girl in the Dauphine, who accepted and gobbled the sandwich and a bar of chocolate that the traveler in the DKW, her neighbor to her left, had passed to her. Many people had left their overheated cars because they had gone hours without advancing. Thirst began. The bottles of lemonade and Coca-Cola, even the onboard wine, now empty to the last drop. The little girl in the 203 was the first to complain, and the soldier and engineer together left their cars, along with the girl's father, to search for water. Ahead of the Simca, where the radio seemed to have all the nourishment it needed, the engineer found a goulot occupied by an older woman with agitated eyes. No, she didn't have water, but could spare some sweets for the girl. The married couple and the ID consulted for a moment before the old woman reached into her purse and took out a small can of fruit juice. The engineer thanked her and wanted to know if he could be of any help. The old man shook his head, but the woman seemed to silently assent. Later, the girl in the Dauphine and the engineer together explored the lanes on the left, without getting too far from their cars. They returned with some pastries and took them to the old woman and the ID, with just enough time to hurry back to their cars under a hail of car horns. Other than those short excursions, there was so little to do that the hours ended up blurring together, each moment no different than the next. At some point, the engineer thought of crossing that day off his agenda and had to stifle a burst of laughter. But later, when everyone started making contradictory calculations, the nuns, the men in the Taunus, the girl in the Dauphine, he realized that they should have kept better track of the time. The local news stations had suspended their daily broadcasts, and only the traveler in the DKW had a shortwave radio that diligently transmitted stock market news. By 3 in the morning, everyone seemed to have reached a tacit agreement to rest, and the column didn't move till dawn. The boys in the Simca got out a few air mattresses and leaned them beside their car. The engineer reclined the back seats of his 404 and offered them as beds to the nuns, who refused. Before lying down for a bit, the engineer thought about the girl in the Dauphine, perfectly still and calm against her steering wheel, and pretended it made no difference to him. He proposed they exchange cars until morning. She denied the offer, claiming she could sleep just fine in any position. For a little while, the engineer could hear the little boy in the Taunus crying, sprawled in the back seat where it must have been too hot. The nuns were still praying when the engineer let himself fall back on the bed and started nodding off, but his sleep hovered too close to waking and finally roused, sweaty and unnerved, initially not knowing where he was. He sat up and noticed signs of movement outside, a sliding of shadows between cars, and he saw a shape drifting toward the border of the highway. He figured it out, and later, he too silently left his car and went to relieve himself on the side of the road. There were no hedges, no trees, only the black and starless field, seemingly an abstract wall hemming in the white ribbon of road top with its frozen river of vehicles. He almost bumped into the farmer in the Ariane, who mumbled something unintelligible. The caustic stink of man joined the stench of gasoline, constant on the overcooked highway, and the engineer hurried back to his car. The girl in the Dauphine slept against her steering wheel, a lock of hair over her eyes. Before getting in his 404, the engineer took a moment to enjoy the shadow of her profile, discerning the parted curve of her lips. The man in the DKW also watched her sleep from the other side, silently smoking. In the morning, the column barely moved, advancing just enough to give them hope the route to Paris would open up at some point in the afternoon. A foreigner arrived at 9 with good news. The cracks in the road had been fixed. Soon, the flow of traffic would return to normal. The boys in the Simca turned on the radio, and one of them climbed onto the roof of the car, shouting and singing. The engineer wasn't buying it. He assumed the foreigner had taken advantage of the general glee to beg an orange, which the married couple from the Ariane gave him. Another foreigner later arrived with the same ruse, but no one gave him a thing. The heat started to rise, and everyone preferred to stay inside the car, waiting for the good news to materialize. At noon, the little girl in the 203 started to cry again, and the girl from the Dauphine went to play with her and make friends with the married couple. The group riding in the 203 had the worst of it. That silent man in the Caravelle lingered to their right, alien to everyone around him, and to the left they suffered the occasional outbursts of the man driving the Floride, who considered the traffic a simply personal affront. When the little girl again complained of thirst, the engineer decided to talk with the farmers in the Arion, believing they had supplies. To his surprise, they were rather friendly. They understood that, given the situation, they must help one another, and they thought that if someone took charge of the group, the woman made a circular gesture with her hand, taking in the dozen cars around them, they would want for nothing until they got to Paris. The idea of promoting himself to chief bothered the engineer. He preferred to conference with the men in the Taunus and the married couple from the Arion. They soon consulted one by one with everyone in the group. The young soldier from the Volkswagen immediately agreed, and the married couple from the 203 offered up their last supplies. The girl in the Dauphine had gotten a glass of grenadine with water for the little girl, who was now laughing and playing. One of the men from the Taunus went to check with the boys in the Simca and got their mocking assent. The pale man, the Carabé, shrugged and said he didn't care. They would do whatever they thought best. The old folks in the ID and the wife from the Boulot lit up with the news, as if they now felt better protected. The drivers of the Floride and the DKW had nothing to say, and the wide-eyed American in the De Soto said something about the will of God. It felt natural for the engineer to propose that one of the occupants of the Taunus, in whom he had an instinctive confidence, should assume command. No one lacked food for the moment, but they needed more water. The chief, which the Simca boys called Taunus simply to amuse themselves, asked the engineer, soldier, and one of the boys to explore the area around the highway and offer food in exchange for drink. Taunus evidently knew how to command and had calculated their supplies would cover them for another day and a half at most, putting them in the least optimistic position. The nuns in the 2HP and the farmers in the Arion had enough supplies for now, and if the search party returned with water, the problem would be fixed. But only the soldier returned with a full bottle of water, and the owner had demanded food for two in exchange. The engineer didn't find anybody who could part with water, but on his trip, he learned other groups like his own had formed to tackle similar problems. At one point, someone riding in an Alfa Romeo refused to discuss the matter with him, and he told him he should see their group's representative, 5 cars back in the same lane. Later, they saw the boy from the Simca return. He hadn't been able to get any water, but Taunus figured they already had enough for the 2 children, the old woman in the ID, and the rest of the women. The engineer was telling the girl in the Dauphine about his trip through the outskirts. It was now 1 in the afternoon, and the sun corralled everyone inside their cars, when she interrupted him with a gesture toward the Simca. In 2 bounding steps, the engineer reached the car and grabbed one of the boys by the elbow, who was lounging back in his seat, chugging the water bottle he smuggled in his jacket. The engineer countered his backlash by pressing harder on his arm. The other boy got out of the car and threw himself at the engineer, who took 2 steps back and awaited him with a feeling almost like compassion. The soldier now came running, and the screaming nuns alerted Taunus and his companion. Taunus heard the commotion, approached the boy with the bottle, and gave him a swift pair of slaps. The boy squealed and whined, while the other boy grumbled without daring to intervene. The engineer took the bottle and handed it to Taunus. Everyone returned to their cars when they heard honking. Uselessly, it turned out, since the column advanced a mere 5 meters. During the drowsy hours of midday, under a sun even hotter than the day before, one of the nuns removed her headcloth so her companion could cool her temples with scented water. The women gradually improvised their Samaritan deeds, going from car to car, busying themselves with the children in order to free up the men. No one complained, though the good humor was forced, built on overused wordplay and public displays of doubt. More than anything, it vexed the engineer and the girl from the Dauphine to feel so sweaty and haggard, though they were touched by the married farmer's near lack of interest in the armpit odor fouling the air whenever they came by to chat or deliver the latest news. Towards sundown, the engineer casually checked his rearview mirror and saw, as always, that same pallid face, the man in the Caravé's visible tension, who like the fat man driving the Floride, had maintained a solitary distance from all the fuss. The engineer thought his features had only sharpened, and he wondered if he might be sick. But later, when he went to chat with the soldier and his wife, he had the chance to see him up close, and he realized the man couldn't be sick. It was something else, a separation, to give it a name. The soldier from the Volkswagen later told him how the man frightened his wife, that silent man who never took his hands off the steering wheel and seemed to sleep with his eyes open. People had formed various hypotheses, even a folklore, to battle the idleness. The children in the Taunus in the 203 had made friends and fought and then reconciled. Their parents visited one another, and the girl from the Dauphine went every now and then to check in on the old woman in the Ivy and the wife in the Bouleau and see how they felt. At dusk, when a gust of wind stormed across the highway and the clouds rising west covered the sky, everyone cheered to think it would soon cool down. I'll go and stop there.